Are you looking for solutions outside yourself? Are they out here, or is the solutions inside yourself? That's what my guest is discussing today. Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay, a podcast discussing meditation, the near-death experience, spiritually inspirational and transformative experiences. Welcome to Inspire Me with Jay. I'm your host, author, and teacher, Jay Spillers. Please do like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to do one-on-one meditation coaching, learn how to meditate, just schedule an appointment. It's in the description. Thank you. So I have a guest today. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Bob. Some people call me Chaplain Bob, Pastor Bob. I just go by Bob or whatever. But yeah. So I have an organization here called Two Homeless Vets, and we help work with veterans pretty much nationwide. We do that through a few different ways and through a few different means. But in addition to that, I speak. I've written a book called Unboxing Love. In addition to that, I'm a huge believer in meditation. I don't know if you use it. I use Insight Timer. I've just had it on my phone forever. I've taken it into multiple war zones, refugee camps, and everything else because I can just I click on it, got my timer and everything. So I do that a lot. But yeah, I'm really excited. I really love what you had to say there at the first. Is are you looking for something outside yourself, because it's really an internal journey, right? And so so yeah, I'm a big believer in that, especially because everybody from Jesus, the Buddha, to Martin Luther King Jr. to Gandhi, they all said that basically. So yeah, absolutely.
So why don't you tell about your journey? Where did you start from?
Sure. That's a really good question. I started from a very fundamental religious kind of background. And if anybody's been in that boat, trust me, I know it well. I was in that boat till I was in about 27, 28. I was in my second counseling treatment center, and a guy came in and presented something to me. And then that's really started my journey. My meditation journey really started, I would say, within a couple, 3 years after that. I started, reading everything that I could from, say, people like Thich Nhat Hanh, Tara Brach. Well, Tara Brach didn't really have that much out there at that point in time. Thich Nhat Hanh already did. But I did pick up a book by Thich Nhat Hanh and some other people that really resonated with me even back in the 90s. And so that started me on my meditation journey. Then what really kind of accelerated it was after a particularly challenging time, I think it was in Iraq. I was coming back to actually go meet my wife, who during the war, we kept her in Korea because she was born and raised there. And so we stayed in USAG Yongsan. And I said, you know what? I'm going to go to this silent retreat. And so for 6 days, it was silent. It was just the only time you spoke with a meditation, one of the meditation teachers who read the Dharma each night, or some section of the Dharma, I should say. But at any rate, I met with her, and she said, well, how's this meditation thing going? I said, well, it sucks. And she kind of smiled, and she said, well, could you tell me more about that? I said, yeah, it really sucks camel's backside. And she just kind of chuckled, and she said, could you tell me what's happening? And I said, yeah, I close my eyes to meditate, and all I see is this really tragic event. When, they had told me that my dad was dead. I was 10 years old, and I go running out into this field in New Mexico, and I extend my middle finger to God and say, F you, God, I never want to hear from you again. And she goes, okay, let's stop there for a minute. Let's pause there for a minute. I said, okay. She said, I want you to kind of rework that in your mind to where you see whatever you call God, the divine, whatever, coming down and embracing you and holding you to their chest and just saying, yeah, this stuff sucks, man. And I'm really sorry to hear that. I'm really sorry that this had to happen to you. But, and so it just kind of I think that meditation is a way to frame things, but I also think it's a way to get in touch with what really matters, which is just this moment. There's nothing we can do about the past. No matter how much anxiety you have about the future, it's not really going to change anything. So be here now. Eckhart Tolle would be a good one for that. And his book and what have you, which is a really interesting story. If you've never heard his story, that's a pretty amazing story as well. But yeah, so that's so my journey kind of accelerated from there. And like I say, I picked up the Insight Timer sometime around whenever I did that particular retreat, as I recall. And I've been on it now for years, and taking classes on there and doing all kinds of stuff. So, yeah. That's kind of my story. That's my elongated story.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting you talking about meditation, because a lot of people think of meditation as just breathing or just visualizing yourself on a beautiful white cloud. And that can
Yeah.
be part of meditation. I do those kind of things. But meditation can be sitting with things that are hard or difficult for us. Because, I remember listening to one meditation teacher was talking about how he overcame anxiety was to just sit with it, kind of detached, but observing it. And sometimes when you observe the pain and the trauma in that sort of peaceful, still state, you can sort of take the power away from it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think part of it, from my perspective, is, excuse me, is looking at something, like looking at a reaction maybe that I had to something or someone, and saying, what caused that to set me off? What caused that to cause me turmoil within? Because one of the things that I'm trying to do, the Christ said, the kingdom is within you. Buddha said, they all basically said the same thing as far as the journey. And so when you have a reaction to something, to be able to go, okay, that's why that bothered me. Maybe it bothered me because of somebody's opinion. Maybe it bothered me because, I had some kind of reaction when I was a kid. It could have been any number of things. But I think that kind of like checking your reactions, which is what meditation, what you were alluding to, that's to me is a big part of meditation, because then I'm able to go, let me just breathe with that. Let me just sit with that for a minute. And Thich Nhat Hanh does this wonderful thing where he says, see that wounded inner child, and bring them in and embrace them. Too many times we try to push that stuff away, and we really need to embrace whatever that hurt is and that pain is, because that's how it gets better. Love gets everything better,
So, in terms of like healing the inner child, you talk about essentially you're like loving on yourself, you're sending like loving intentions in that moment.
Yes.
Is that kind of
Yes.
what you're getting at?
Absolutely. And you're letting them know that you're listening to them. What happens to a little child that you don't listen to? Well, they get louder, or they get more irritated, or they hurt. And so they make sure everybody knows that they hurt. But what happens when we actually just sit down and listen to someone? We actually just go, okay, wow. Yeah, that's really something. Let's talk about that. Let's like really dig into that, to give you a classic example, for me, I only wanted to, for a long time in my life, I only wanted to be in relationships that hurt, that caused me pain, physically, emotionally, whatever. And so I had to dive into that. And one of the things that I found as I dove into that, like we moved a lot when I was a kid. And then my dad died when I was 10. And I've been losing people ever since. And I just said, I don't want to hurt anymore. And from a kid's standpoint, that's really natural, from a young child standpoint. So that was one of these places in my system where the young child got stuck. Now, once I was able to identify that and go, okay, then I could begin to understand why I was having trouble with my wife. Then I could begin to understand why I was having trouble with friends and I wasn't able to build any like long-term friendships, you know. So I think that meditation's really good for that. That's like a huge part of it. Huge part of it for me.
And in terms of finding within, I think a lot of times, you know, especially in like evangelical fundamental things, they kind of frown on the idea of looking within,
Oh
you know,
yeah.
because you're always supposed to find it only in reading the Bible or external
Yeah.
things.
Yep.
And I mean, the Bible itself, probably a lot of it was written when these authors were in meditative states, because that's where
Absolutely.
the truth flows.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what's interesting about what you were saying was, you're absolutely right. The fundamental movement, is, and I like to say the fundamental movement is fundamentally screwed up. But the reason for that is because it's based on the exterior. Now, if we were to look at, let's just look at the Christ. When he was walking on earth, it had nothing to do with his exterior. In fact, he kept pointing to the interior. He kept pointing to the interior and kept pointing to the interior. Buddha, same thing. Buddha could have been a prince. And one of the ways that, to me, that I recognize a spiritual teacher is by a real simple test. All they really had to do was just shut up and color. Now, what I mean by that is Buddha could have stayed a prince and been a king. And he never had to like look at poverty. He never had to look at these things, but he did. You know, Jesus probably could have been a pretty good furniture maker. You know, he was a carpenter by trade. He could have inherited his dad's business and just shut up and color. Martin Luther King Jr., shut up and color. You know, keep to those churches, keep to that area. But to me, what spirituality encourages us to do is the same thing as meditation. It encourages us to identify the oneness, the oneness. And I think that in order to best understand this, I like to take people to the temptation of Christ in the desert with the devil, Satan, whatever. And here were the four temptations. Number one, he was tempted to forget his own identity. It kept saying, if you are the Son of God, in other words, prove yourself. Prove yourself to the exterior. Jesus never fell for that. Number two, he was tempted for power. Well, do this and I will make you the ruler of all these nations. He's like, nah. Then he was tempted for prestige. Do this and these people will fall down and worship you. No, it's okay. And then he was tempted for possessions. Turn these bread into stone. And he said, no, I don't live by bread alone. I'm okay. So every time we look at that, to me, it's like I was not raised with that being a temptation. In fact, if anything, the more power you can get, the more people you can bring to church, right? The more people you can make fundamental. The more possessions you have, the more you can like give to the church. So it's this kind of a self-propelling dysfunction, if you will. And so that's kind of the way I've seen it. I think it's very, very difficult to find a spiritual path that in modern day America, my personal opinion, a spiritual path within the Christian church. That's been my experience. I would love to try and start one, but I think that that's a very difficult thing to find. Yeah. I would tell you a couple of writers, though. You know
Well,
what?
I mean, it's interesting.
Good.
You're listening to the Inspire Me with Jay podcast. Please do like and subscribe to the channel, bringing hope and inspiration to the world.
Oh, I was just going to say, I would tell you a couple of writers, actually about three writers that I would say are very, have encouraged me greatly in the search for that. One is Thomas Merton, who brought back what's called contemplative Christianity, which is all about meditation. In fact, they've got a contemplative Christianity. If you look at it, they've got meditation groups online. But then in addition to that, there's Rob Bell, who wrote phenomenal books. Everything is Spiritual, which I found to be really great. Love Wins, another one of his. Thomas Merton wrote several books too, but it's just like a whole lot of them. And then there's a guy by the name of Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R. And he's interesting because every time he starts to speak, the first things that he says is, I have no idea why the Pope still allows me to be a monk, a Franciscan monk. But he wrote a great book called Jesus's Alternative Plan. He also has a great recording called True Self, False Self. He's got a lot of really good material out there. If you really want to see what an alternative way of the Christ looks like, those are some authors I would definitely check out. Yeah.
You know, what's interesting is you're talking about identity with Christ. The first temptation was identity. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't know is their true identity because,
Yeah.
you know, I believe that we are a beautiful white light being and that we are part of
Yeah.
the divine. We have that divine spark. And for a
Yeah.
lot of people, either they don't believe that or they say at a surface level, oh, yeah, that sounds nice, but they
Yeah.
don't really genuinely believe it. They don't really know who they are. And
Totally.
it essentially would change everything because if you start to understand what your identity is, it's a total game changer. And even
Absolutely.
like when you talk about like in evangelicalism, even if there is such a thing as a sin nature, and if we have it, that's only at the surface. You dig deeper to the true
Yeah.
identity, you know, sort of before the fall, and you
Yeah.
find out who we truly are, which is that beautiful white light being
Yeah. Yeah.
that, you know,
Yeah.
basically supersedes a sin identity.
Absolutely. And I think that like if you remember the temptations of Christ, right? If you look at those temptations, the temptation was to move away from that identity for peace. For an example, if I have more possessions, well, screw my real identity. I don't need that because I got these possessions, right? So all of a sudden life sucks because possessions come and go. You know, I had a meme the other day that I put out there. I said, things rust, people cause distrust, but the perfect love embrace that's on your soul will be eternal. But if you look at that power comes and goes. Holy crap. How many times have we seen that in American politics? Not going to go down that road, but you know, the possessions, they're all like temporary. And what I believe Christ was, Jesus and later the Christ was encouraging us to do was to say, let's focus on the permanent. And the permanent is that you are a divine being, and we're all going to that perfect light when we go. Just have faith in that, because that's where peace passes all understanding. I think that what we always forget is that Jesus Christ had nothing to do with the formation of Christianity. Absolutely nothing. He had been gone for 313 years when the catacombs, this organization called The Way that was hiding in the catacombs because they were being killed, was suddenly the church as created by Constantine and the Nicene Council. So again, we're not even talking about the same organization. You know what I mean? I mean, organization. We're not even talking about the same person at that point. The Christian religion, or originally the Catholic Church, was created for control by an earthly emperor who, if you look him up, he was not a particularly nice guy. You know, so if we're talking about something that's based on the Christ, it's a very different thing. It's been my experience.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about control in the church because, you know, for the first few centuries, universalism, the idea that eventually everybody would find their way to God and enter heaven, was actually a pretty prevalent view. And then, you know, a few centuries later, it started gradually being weeded out. You know, it started being declared a heresy. And, you know, the idea of eternal hell, an endless hell is one of the strongest ways that the church can use to control people. Well, if you go too far away from us, you might end up in that
Yeah,
place forever.
sure. Yeah. Because we got to control you. We need more money. We need more power. We need more people. You know, if you look at St. Francis, for an example, um, he was another one of those you can kind of identify as a shut up and color kind of person. But he was saying, no, we're all going to the same place. So a Franciscan monk takes a vow of poverty. Now, I don't have a problem with poverty, but I don't have a problem with wealth either. I think it's what you worship. You know, if your security is in the money, then your security is in a really shitty position. It's just not going to work, you know. I mean, if we haven't proven that by now, but at any rate, but if you look at St. Francis, in his last days, he was telling people, no, we're all going to the same place. It's all about identifying your identity right here, right now. And to do that, in fact, let me just tell you a story that Richard Rohr shared on one of his things that I was listening to, one of the times I was listening to him. So this is a story that he shared. He said, this young boy of like 5 years old just had a baby sister. And so the young boy went to his mom and dad and said, hey, mom and dad, I want to sleep in the crib with my baby sister tonight. And they were kind of like thinking that was kind of strange, but they thought, okay, well, okay. And so they put him in the crib with his baby sister. And then they were listening to the door to kind of try and figure out what was going on. And he said to the baby sister, quick, tell me where I came from. I'm starting to forget. You see, around the age of 6 or 7, we have to deal with all of the shit we call the world. And when you have to develop a way to deal with that, you have to develop that false self. And the thicker that mask gets for the false self, the more challenging it is. Brennan Manning, another one of my favorite writers, wrote a book called The Ragamuffin Gospel. And the whole concept of the Ragamuffin Gospel is if you look at the people who literally followed Jesus, and then, you know, some of them stuck around to follow the Christ as well. If you look at the people who actually followed that way, they were the ragamuffins. They were the ones who were really, you know, successful. The ones who really followed him, they were the ragamuffins. They were the guys who, like, basically, you know, their life pretty well sucked, you know, and that was just the reality. So I think that it's time to kind of get to a point where we understand the who of who Jesus is, you know, and we kind of grasp that, and we kind of embrace that, because that's where the peace is. Keep in mind, there's always been a remnant that believed. For an example, right after the church was created, 313 AD, there was a group called the Desert Fathers. And it's a really interesting group to study, like St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, and some of these. And they just basically, they were like sitting there going, this is bullshit. There's no way. No, this is not going the right direction here. And they took off for the desert. That's why they call them the Desert Fathers. And that's a lot of the reason why we have things like Coptic Christianity. If you look at Coptic Christianity, it's much more into meditative states than what, well, certainly more than fundamental. And I think the Catholic Church is just, since the 60s, Thomas Merton, they're waking up to the idea of contemplative Christianity or contemplative processing. Yeah. Father Thomas Keating is another one.
Is that why you don't...
What's that?
Go ahead.
No,
I was just saying, is that why there's no power in Christianity, partly, much of Christianity, is because people don't have that connection. They don't have the, they don't take time to connect, and it's just kind of surface, you know. So there's like power issues, and there's scandals, and there's, you don't see the fruits of the Holy Spirit a lot, and you see, all these things because they're not really connected.
Not at all. Not at all. And the fruits that you do see are manufactured. In other words, oh, well, we're supposed to be this way, so we're going to be that way. That's not really the way it happens. The way it happens is the more you get into your inner divinity and understand who you are, the more these just naturally flow. You know, the more you can heal the things that are hurt within, the more kindness, the more that just happens. And so, no, you're absolutely right. I think that's a big part of but this is the interesting thing in America. So in America, we have extreme nationalism from the fundamental side. And this is one of the reasons why I believe people still identify Christianity as a power. because we're really just kissing up to the whole idea of the military industrial complex. I mean, oh, my country, 'tis of thee, and oh God, God bless the USA, and all of this stuff that goes with it. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I used to live in China and I love this country. And let me tell you, I've lived in a lot of different countries, and China's one country I will never go back to for some very strong reasons. But they worship a different type of power. But we worship that power, and we kind of supplanted that with who we think God is. And I don't like the Christian nationalism. I don't know of anybody who's truly kind of coming into what we're talking about here today who does. But I don't think it has anything to do with Christ. I'll tell you that. Yeah.
What's kind of interesting too is that, there's this inability, to question things like Israel and
Oh yeah,
things
yeah,
like that, because it's like, okay, well, I love the Jewish people, and there's many wonderful Israelis, and I
yeah.
don't have a problem with them having their homeland, but the government of Israel, there's a
Sure,
lot of problems there, and you just sort of
sure.
overlook everything that happens.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But we've been overlooking things for centuries, haven't we? I mean, I don't, it's kind of like, if we were to go to the Christian tradition, we kind of overlook certain things, all the way back to, well, actually the knowledge of good and evil, that's kind of a good thing, right? I mean, why is that a problem? So we have to kind of look at it from a different angle. We have to look at that, to me, from an angle of, they wanted more than what they had. I like to tell people I believe there's two gods, or two divinities, if you will. There's a divinity who says, I want more. And there's a divinity who says, no, just love each other. Don't be an asshole. And between those two divinities, we really cover the whole spectrum. Buddha was much obviously on the side of the Buddha was much on the side of obviously the love. But so is Gandhi, so is MLK Jr. I've chosen to love because hate is too big of a burden to bear. And when you begin to look at some of the teachings of Buddha, there's a wonderful story that the Buddha was up on the mountain and he was teaching some of his disciples, and they had been meditating and what have you. And this farmer runs up to him and goes, have you seen my cows? I can't find my cows. My cows got out and I can't find them. And the Buddha says, no, we have not seen your cows. And he goes, oh, and so this farmer runs off. And then the Buddha looks at his students and goes, now, aren't you glad you don't own any cows? So there was this kind of like an attitude of being in the moment that was taught in Buddhism that the West didn't really ever get, because we were too busy off conquering and too busy off trying to slay, whatever we were trying to kill. What if they don't believe with the same way we do, kill them. One of the ways that you can tell it's a religion is that there's always an other. Does that make sense? There's always an other. So for an example, Christian religion. Well, there was that other religion, thus the Great Crusades. Well, those poor people are being punished by God, thus the other. Well, those people were meant to be slaves, the other. Well, everybody knows that women shouldn't have the right to vote, and women shouldn't do this, and women shouldn't do that, the other. There's always an other. We're right, you're wrong. That's all there is to it. Think just for a second, how many people have died in the name of the other? Christ was never about the other. If you look at the walk of Christ, the one person he said really understood his message was who? A Roman centurion. So let's break that piece down. Polytheistic. He was anything but a Jew. You were not going to be a Roman centurion, be a Jew. Wasn't going to. So polytheistic, probably at the very least polyamoral, possibly, LGBTQ. And so you had this person who Jesus said, that guy's got it figured out. You have a good Samaritan. Let's break that down. Samaritans were not even considered Jews. Keep in mind, Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't a Christian. They were not even considered good Jews. So I think that there's a a commonality here in who Jesus was saying, this is a good person. It was the person who loved, who had faith, and who accepted just loving others. The Roman centurion, he loved his servant. That's why he said, hey, Jesus, look, I get it. I suck. I'm not a good human. I'm not a good person, but if you'll just heal my servant, that would be awesome, because I know you're the only one who can. So he had faith. He said, look, I'm not even worthy to take the sandals off of your feet. If you were to come to my house, I'm not worthy to have you in my house, but I know that you can serve, you can take care of my servant. So again, to me, these are questions that we should have answered a long time ago about Christ, but we always kind of swept them under the rug, because that's the fundamental way. You have to have this doctrine, because this gives us power or prestige or more possessions, But again, those are the same three ways Christ was tempted. So I find that interesting.
Have you ever wanted to learn to meditate? Check out my book, Meditation for Everyone: How to Quickly Have a More Peaceful, Mindful, and Fulfilled Life, and support this channel. With Meditation for Everyone, you will learn to quickly and easily meditate, relieve stress and anxiety, alleviate depression, and have more joy, peace, and relaxation. What you will learn: mindfulness, the art of stillness, step by step on how to meditate, strategies for overcoming challenges to meditation, and much more. D. Mason said this is a nice meditation book, even for those already meditating. I agree with the statements that it will help to have a more peaceful, mindful, and fulfilled life. 4.6-star rating, available on Amazon. What's kind of interesting about the other is that, you see it so much everywhere, well, I don't trust people that are liberal, or I don't trust people that are conservative. I don't trust people of this race or this sexual orientation or whatever. They're all this, that, and the other, but when you start to realize that there's dignity and divinity in all people, then it can really change your perspective.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And that's a very scary realization for people that are used to power. It's a very scary, if you control God, you control the afterlife. And if you control the afterlife, you control the person, because that's what they're working toward, right? We all know everybody's going to die, And so thus the name of my book is called Unboxing Love. I think it's still on Amazon. I don't know. It's called Unboxing Love. But what I ask is a real simple question. How big is the divine? How big is the divine? And the reason I ask that question is this: ever since man was created, we've been trying to make them smaller. I think maybe it's time we just imagine that the divine is in all. There's a really good book by, I'm trying to remember his name because I've got it on my Audible account, but he wrote a book called All Is Well. And, or he's got this theory called All Is Well. And he said the way that you can tell a spiritual being is because they believe three simple words: all is well. All is well, because the divine is in all. And the divine's perfect love. And if you go with that, if you believe that, then all is well. So yeah. But you're right. I think it's a power thing. I totally think it's a power thing. You see it in America really strong. The Roman Catholic Church, you don't really see it as much anymore, but you certainly saw it during, the Dark Ages, the Crusades, and all of that. It was all about power. The problem is we just never learned the lesson. How well did that work out? I mean, we're still licking the wounds from the Crusades. We're still like going, wow, So, I mean, Afghanistan's a classic example.
mean like everybody, all Muslims are like the Taliban and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's
And that
always
sort
an
of that.
other. Yep, there's always an other, and you see this anytime there's some national type thing like that, right? Like you saw a mosque where people were like painting graffiti. You see all of this kind of stuff happening. Very few people just rest in what is. Very few, if any, really, if you want to know the truth. I mean, and a classic example of that is like even today, how many Teslas are being burned. I mean, if the divine is in all and all is in the divine, okay, well, rest in what is, because what else is there? I'm not going to say political this or political that. Why? Because it's all divine. So just, relax. That's the way I look at it. Yeah.
Well, if you think if everybody was to come more in alignment with their authentic self, a lot of the issues out here would just sort of dissipate, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. They would completely dissipate. I mean, if you look at, and I guess I keep referencing this because for me, I was raised very Christian religion, but if you look at the Christ, yeah, he was disturbed whenever he went into the temple and they were making it about money instead of making it about realizing who you are. That pissed him off. I think it still does because we still make it about money, but just not the same thing as a temple tax, but we do it in other ways. Well, you got to tithe, you got to do this, you got to do that. But the bottom line is that upset him. It upset him that people didn't have faith, which all faith means is you're forgetting that all is divine. If I'm on a boat and that boat is sinking and it sinks and I die, that was my time. How relaxing is that? Now, does that mean I go scarf down any food that I want? Well, yeah, except for the fact that it makes me feel bad. I mean, so that's the reason I don't eat that kind of, just anything I want. But at any rate, all that to say, to me, it's like we forget the inner divinity and we forget that the divine is in all. It's really hard to be a slave owner and look at that slave and go, yeah, you're one of God's sons. The divine is in you too. But I'm going to keep treating you like shit. I mean, that's basically, okay. Because you're going to make me more money. And if you make me more money, I'm more comfortable. And, I can give more money to the church. And so there's this, kind of cycle thing of just like, yeah. So it's interesting.
Well, it's kind of like when Christ taught about, when you see other people, you see me. And,
Yeah.
The idea that, because we think of like the third commandment is, don't take God's name in vain. But what about like when you just demean and insult other people? If they have the divine within them, aren't you sort of demeaning God in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And if you look at the teachings of Christ, that's one of those things that, like I say, the Jesus' alternative plan really hones in on that, the one by Richard Rohr, because he goes through basically the Sermon on the Mount and all of this, and he kind of like says, well, let's break this down. Let's break this down to what it's like. Blessed are the poor. It didn't originally say poor in spirit. That was kind of put in there so that the middle class, who Matthew was kind of mainly focused on, wouldn't feel bad. But blessed are the poor. Why? Because they kind of have to depend on the idea that God's bigger. They don't have an option. They have to depend on the idea that their food for that day is going to come from some divine source because they don't have any food. And so there's just a lot that happens when you realize the divine's in all and all are in the divine. And that's a complete shift from any organized religion that I know. Because a organized religion, by definition, has to be a self-feeding organism. It has to feed itself, right? I mean, to grow, you have to feed yourself. How do we do that? Well, nowadays, what they do is they make churches like a show, basically, right? Or some imam, if we're going to talk about the Muslim tradition, will preach so much virulent hate that these mobs form in his mosque. Or if you're a Jew, we talk about how terrible those people are, over there. I mean, it's all self-feeding organisms. It's all self-feeding organisms. That's why Richard Rohr has this organization called the Contemplation and Action thing. It's out of Albuquerque, but yeah, Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R. I've got to get links or something sometime to be able to put in these things. But and he's got an organization that's all about contemplation and then action. Because those are kind of the two parts. Yes, we contemplate and we stay focused, but then we also take action to let people know their own divinity. We also take action to try to heal the wounds that have happened because of colonialism in Africa. We also take action to try to help heal and help people see that, no, there are some of us that believe that there's a divine being who's bigger than somebody who's, raping your continent, So, yeah.
So in terms of like the work you do you help do you help veterans kind of see these issues themselves, like see the divinity within and start to help transform their life through that?
Well, that's part of it. I think that one of the things that you see in veterans is that trauma, particularly PTSD, is a tremendous mask for original pain. When I'm talking about original pain, I'm talking about the pain that we picked up when we were like 5, 6, 7. And then all of a sudden we had to start wearing a bigger mask and a bigger mask and a bigger mask. And so what that looks like is when you join the military, you're be a man, kind of thing. And you kind of have this like, okay, I got to prove myself. I got to get out there and do this. And it's really interesting because if you're ever sitting around a room full of veterans, it's really interesting. Well, I did this, this, and this. And somebody else says, well, I did this, 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 and this, and this. And all of a sudden you get this pecking order. And that's a way that I know that something's about religion. There's a pecking order, well, I'm a priest. Well, I'm a pope. I'm a bishop, and all of these different pecking order kind of things. And you get into that really pretty much in every religion. So it's, but yeah, so what I try to do is I try to kind of introduce them slowly to an idea of meditation, because still the mind, still the soul. If you can make the mind still, sometimes you'll get a wink from your soul. If you can just still the mind long enough, your soul will wink at you sooner or later. Because your soul's there. It's just that it's masked up because there's so much hurt and pain and all that crap. So.
So like in terms of your meditation, do you have like a meditation practice you do privately? Do you like meditate for 30, 45 minutes a day, any particular time?
Sure.
Or
Yeah, I typically like I'm usually up by about 2:30 or 3 a.m. And so I'll do about the first thing that I typically do is I'll do about 12 minutes of just silent meditation. And then depending on the day, I'll do a class or two out of the Insight Timer, or I'll have a book that I'm listening to that kind of brings me into a meditative state. And I just try to focus on the teaching. There's some really, really amazing writers like Tara Brach. Tara Brach wrote several books. Like I've got to look. Hang on, I'm going to look this up right quick, because if I don't, I'm going to forget about it. So Tara Brach wrote books. Let me see if I can get into this thing here. Because I really want to quote these. Yeah, Tara Brach. She wrote books. Oh, here's a good one from her. Radical Acceptance. That is a great book. Radical Acceptance. Radical Self-Acceptance. Radical Compassion. These are a couple of my favorite Tara Brach books. And I strongly encourage people to take a look at those. Some of my favorite, hang on here. Okay, I was looking for, some of my favorite books by Rob Bell. How to Be Here. That was a really great book. I really enjoyed that one. Everything is Spiritual. And by the way, that's a really good YouTube video too, where he goes through and he said, why was the first being called Atom, as in atom, as in the origin of everything? Why is that? So he goes through and he tracks and he shows how basically the God molecule, if you will, is the originator of all. You know, we were so afraid of evolution. But the amazing thing to me is, as I got older, I said, well, wait, I'm changing every day, and evolution is just changing. You know, hopefully we're growing smarter and what have you, and not more bitter. But and then like I say, I'll be listening to one of those books, depending on kind of where I'm at. I'll be listening to one of those books, and then I've got some other things that I do from the standpoint of getting ready for my day. So usually by about 4:30, I'm ready for my day, and then I might do some writing. I've got several projects that I want to do as far as writing goes, and so I get that done, and then usually by about 5 a.m., I'm on my way to the gym. Come back, get my dogs, get them running, get them some exercise, and then my day starts. That's pretty much it right now. Yeah. How about you? What's your practice? What's that look like?
I usually meditate in the afternoon for about 40 minutes. But like before I wake up, I do prayer and affirmations. And then when I go to bed, prayer and affirmations. I read scripture and I listen to a lot of things. I'm doing like a conscious business accelerator. It's for people that have like healing things that they want to do. It could be yoga, meditation, could be different things that are trying to impact the world. And I'm going through that right now
Nice.
because it's sort of a 3 week thing you're going through. But I've learned a lot of things, in that.
Oh, that's cool. And so that kind of like helps, like, let's say somebody want to be a yoga teacher or meditation teacher, that helps them kind of elevate their game in the business world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
a lot of what they get down to is just coming at it from the heart, being authentic and being passionate about what you're saying, because, it's easy to kind of like put something together. Like I'll do a lecture on something and it's kind of like, um, a high school science class on photosynthesis. It's kind of boring and dry, but you want to like speak from the heart and be
Yeah,
passionate about what you're saying because you could say a lot of good things, but it has to be from the heart that you speak.
absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, totally. Totally agree with that. That's great. Wow, that's really cool. I like that. I like that. I want to know how that goes. I'd love to see what how that turns out with you. Yeah. Yeah.
So where can people reach out to you?
The best one is, should I just put this in the chat? I've got
Can you just what?
can I just put this email in the chat?
Sure.
2homelessvets.com is the best email to reach out to me on. That's probably the best. I've got a couple of different Facebook groups. I've got Be Graceful with 2Ls.com. Then I've got another one, just like my regular Facebook page or whatever. Let me do this, because what I'll do is, before we get off of here, I'll get my Facebook profile thing and then put that on here as well, because I'm always up for like talking with people that are kind of open to a different way of seeing things. I think that one of the problems that we get into is that we wind up having too much, I guess, for lack of a better term, inbreeding in what we believe. And that's a real sure way to have a really sucky life, been my experience. So yeah, but
Yeah, and
yeah.
I did put your thing on Facebook. Yeah.
Oh, good, 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 good. Yeah, please. I mean, I'm always up for
For the
hearing from
description.
people and visiting. I think that we need more of that connectivity. You know, we really need more of that. It's interesting because I just saw a video that a dear brother of mine did over in Colorado, and he said, you know, there's certain things that are this is from the COVID lockdown. He said there's certain things that we're learning now that I hope we never forget. And number one is we need community, right? We need each other. We were made with that need because that's how we heal. That's how we grow. That's how we develop. You know, iron sharpens iron is one Old Testament passage says. But that's a huge, huge thing for us to understand, you know, is that we need each other. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. So, yeah, absolutely. I would love to like see a group started that would be, you know, meditation and some teaching and kind of see where it goes, you know.
Well, is there like one final word you'd like to leave with the audience before we close out?
Sure, absolutely. I would encourage people to just ask themselves a real simple question. And that's this: how big is the one I believe is divine? And what is their defining characteristic? Because you see, these two things will define whether you have a life or an existence. If the one you believe is divine is very limited, then the power is going to be limited. If they're an angry being that's just like ready to pounce on you, then you're always going to feel this guilt and shame and underlying sense of dread. But to reverse that, if I believe that there's this divine being who's in all and all is well, because this divine being is perfect love beyond human comprehension. And I keep coming to beyond human comprehension because what happens is as soon as we have that idea, we try to limit it to our group. It's beyond human comprehension. I can't possibly comprehend perfect love. Hell, I can't hardly, you know, it's hard for me sometimes to communicate with my wife, and all of a sudden we're talking about a divine being. I mean, what the hell? I mean, you know, I mean, nothing personal, but you know, we have a hard enough time getting along with each other. So for me, it's because I believe there's an unlimited divine being, and because I believe that they're by their very core nature, perfect love beyond human comprehension. All is well.